Hi art nerds, happy holidays. So I have another off the script Paperchild activity for you guys. So you won't find it in this line art pack, although you will find the line art free down in the description below if you want to print and color your own. So yesterday we assembled this adorable Tanner Nutcracker. Today we're doing Pancake, the kitten. Looks like he's gotten into the tinsel. I wasn't going to do any pancake paper children, but you know, he's just so cute, and kittens getting into Christmas stuff is even cuter, so I couldn't resist. So if you don't know what paper children are, they're a great way for you to take your two-dimensional art into the 3D world with a little bit of clever paper engineering. So here are some example paper children from June and July 2020 when I was working on the 7-inch Kara Volume 2 Kickstarter. We have kickstarted and the books are in the mail. I'm super excited about that. So you can order Volume 1 or you can pre-order Volume 2 from my shop. I'll link that in the description below as well. So this is the line art that we're going to be coloring today. You can print and color this using whatever you want to color with, but I do recommend you print it on a heavier and sturdier paper like cardstock, 80-pound cover paper, 90-pound watercolor paper, or Bristol board. You can even work heavier than that. Today I am painting on Canon XL watercolor paper, which is a 180-pound, so a little bit thicker than cardstock, 180-pound cellulose, so that is tree pulp or wood pulp based paper. This was inked with a Sakura Pigma FB, that is a waterproof brush pen, and I am going to paint with the Core mini palette. But first, I want to secure my paper so that it doesn't buckle all over the place. So I'm using some blue painter's tape to secure it to a piece of chipboard. So this was the second Paperchild I painted in one day. I was trying to get both of these kind of bonus paper children finished so I could start releasing the assembled Paperchild tutorials, which, speaking of, how are you guys enjoying this little Advent series? Every day there's a different Paperchild design. There's a watercolor tutorial, and then there is an assembly tutorial. So stay tuned for the assembly tutorial a little bit later today. So Pancake is a black kitten, and I'm going to be painting a lot of black today. So I wanted to start with the things that are not black. So I painted a layer of cool yellow for his eyes, and I painted the inside of his ears and mouth using magenta. Now we're going to have a whole lot of fun. I wanted to do some rainbow colored tinsel. So I'm applying a wash of clean water all over the left side of the tinsel. I'm not doing the piece of tinsel that's wrapped around him, but the one that's wrapped in front of him. And now we're going to do a whole lot of chromatic wet into wet blending, starting with magenta. We're going to go from magenta to purple, from purple to ultramarine blue, and then ultramarine blue to phthalo blue. And it's really helpful to work kind of quickly with this, so you can get a little bit sloppy here because the quicker you work, the more your colors are likely to blend. Now, if you're painting on a wet watercolor paper, a cellulose-based watercolor paper like this one, water tends to evaporate quickly because it doesn't really get a chance to soak into the fibers. It takes a really long time for water to kind of soak into the fibers of a cellulose paper because they're so compact and pressed down. So when your paper dries, it's all just evaporating rather than soaking into the paper itself. So when you're doing a rainbow blend like this one on cellulose-based watercolor paper, not only do you want to work quickly and do most of your blending in one go, which we're going to do today, but you also want to kind of not mess around with it too much because it's much more likely to turn into mud. So we have our magenta to purple to ultramarine blend. Now we're going to do the other side. We're going to go at phthalo to sap green to cool yellow to orange. And I'm just using the same technique, and I'm using a large round watercolor brush. I'm actually using the silver black velvet watercolor brushes for this. They are a mix of synthetic and natural fibers. I happen to really like them, and they really lend themselves to watercolor applications such as this one. So I'm starting with my phthalo blue, and I don't mind if it kind of overblends or overextends where I had in mind. Part of that uncontrolled blending is what makes wet into wet watercolors so fun. Then I am adding in our sap green. And speaking of wet into wet blending, I have several tutorials here on the channel where I show you different art pieces that you can create using wet into wet blending, as well as some tutorials to help you get started on your watercolor journey. So I will link those playlists down in the description below if you guys are looking for a little bit more help with your watercolor. Then we go from sap green to our cool yellow, and I am cleaning my brush in between colors, and I have a paint puck, which is a small silicone scrubby thing at the bottom of my cup. And then we're going to go from our cool yellow to a pyrrole orange. That's a very reddish orange included in this set. And we're just going to kind of let the water do its thing. So to encourage this to dry a little bit quicker, I have my dehumidifier on, and I also have my fan on so we get the air really moving so it can evaporate quicker. I live in Southeast Louisiana, and being able to control dry times is pretty important. So now we're going to do the piece that is wrapped all the way around behind Pancake, and we want to think about what colors would be behind him so that we can decide what colors to use at the tail end over here. And you know, it would have been nice to showcase other blends that we weren't really able to show in this boa, but I did want to keep in mind that he is kind of blocking some colors, so there are going to be some colors that we just don't see. So I end up kind of repeating the phthalo blue and the sap green, because if we were to go behind Pancake, the orange would have gone into a alizarin crimson, and the alizarin crimson would have gone into the magenta, and that cycle would have started all over again with the magenta going into ultramarine and ultramarine going into phthalo. So while that dries, I'm trying to hover my wrist and hand above the paper. It's actually pretty challenging. And I am painting a very light wash of phthalo blue on Pancake's eyes. So I also want to just kind of point out to you guys that because I was trying to do this illustration really quickly, there's a lot of stuff that's kind of sloppy, and I would handle a little bit differently if I wasn't trying to get this project finished up. However, I'm pretty happy with how he turned out in the end. I'm not disappointed with it, but there are different ways you can handle some of these techniques that might be a little bit more polished and a little bit more professional. So I'm still painting all the not black things. So we are painting his little brass tag. And for that, I am using the quinacridone gold. That's the second color at the top going from the left. And then I wanted his eyes to be even more greenish. So I did another layer of phthalo blue. So it looks like the tinsel is mostly dry. I think we can apply a layer to that soon, but first I'm going to paint his collar. Now to get the red that his collar is normally in the comic, I mix some alizarin crimson with some magenta. Oh, and speaking of, if you're new to my work and you have not heard me talk about 7-inch Kara, 7-inch Kara is my watercolor webcomic. It updates every Friday, and you guys can read the first 7 chapters for free at 7inchkara.com. If you're more of a print book person like me, you can order the first volume and pre-order the second volume. Zooming in now. For a closer look, we're going to start adding in some more details to our rainbow tinsel. So I'm going in with a thicker saturation of magenta. I'm trying to leave some lighter highlights of the original light color because we want it to look like light is hitting the tinsel. And if you guys have ever looked at tinsel closely, you'll notice that it refracts the light in a lot of different ways. Then I'm going in with a really thick mix of the purple and trying to blend it into the magenta as well, so we continue that transition of color. I'm also blending it up into the ultramarine. So the reason I selected colors in the sequence that I selected is because they all blend really well into each other, and you can utilize the darker colors in between to add shadows to the lighter colors on either side. So I'm going to extend my phthalo blue shadows into my sap green. And then eventually I'm going to switch out my phthalo blue for a sap green, as you guys can see here, and extend my sap green into that cooler yellow. So the cooler yellow gives you a more saturated color, but it doesn't necessarily give you a darker color. You also want to be kind of careful with this color because it tends to be kind of opaque. And it can end up making your work look either lighter than you wanted, or it can kind of obscure your line art. So I'm going into that with some quinacridone gold. So that's that yellow-orange color we used on Pancake's collar. And then I'm going into that area while it's still wet with the Pyrrole orange. And I'm going to go into the Pyrrole orange using alizarin crimson, which is a warmer red. So while that's still drying, I'm gonna hover my wrist and start painting Pancake. So this set does not have a black, and while you can mix a close approximation for a black using this set, I'm covering a lot of ground here. So I grab my Daily Driver watercolor palette and I'm going to use that to add in some actual black a little bit later on. But I'm starting with a wash of Payne's Gray. And I'm even covering the pink inside his ears and his little pink nose, and that's going to give us kind of a dusky pink color. So when Pancake is mostly dry, I can go in and add some more phthalo blue to his green eyes. And I can also go in and start adding some more shadows and some more details to our tinsel. So I'm going to use the dioxine purple to add more shadows into our ultramarine blue and into our magenta. I'm going to use our phthalo blue and then sap green to add in more shadows to our phthalo blue, our sap green, and our cooler yellow. And I'm trying to keep the shadows more to the middle and bottom or away from the light, so turning away from the light source. So when you're watercoloring, it's really important to keep a light source in mind. I have a basic default light source. My default light source is usually going off or coming from the character's right, like behind their left, so our viewer right. And it's coming from behind them usually. Although sometimes I'll do it where it's coming from in front of them. But basically you just want to keep your light source as consistent as possible within the same illustration. You can vary it between different illustrations. And while that is drying, I'm going in with a mix of our Payne's Gray and a little bit of black from my Daily Driver palette. So it's probably like an ivory black. And it's not a full saturation mix, and I am leaving gray highlights here and there, like the light is hitting the black cat's fur. So one of my tricks for painting quickly, that doesn't always mean painting well, in fact it often does not mean painting well, is that I will paint things while things they are adjacent to are still wet, so long as there is a little rim of paper, dry paper or unpainted paper, between the two colors. So me adding in that shadow layer to the tinsel and me painting Pancake's fur, because there's a rim of light, a rim of dry paper between the wet areas that I'm painting in shadow and Pancake, I'm going to be able to do this without a lot of color pollution, a lot of color mixing, a lot of color bleeding. This is not necessarily a great technique. It's not a technique that I think brings out the best in my art or the best in other artists, but it's a huge time saver. And when you paint comics and you paint comics in watercolor, you need as many time savers as you can, and you start figuring out all the tricks you can kind of get away with. That doesn't make you a good watercolorist, but it makes you a decent comic watercolorist. And when it comes to comics, being half decent that'll get you a lot of the way, because comics it's not just one illustration, one illustration, one illustration, one. No, it's like 5 illustrations on a page or 10 illustrations on a page, and it's read really quickly. So there are some areas where you can afford to kind of cut some corners. And in the end, one of the best pieces of art advice I was ever given is it doesn't matter what you do as long as the end product looks good. So in this instance, it doesn't really matter that in terms of time, I'm cutting some corners as long as the end product still works. Now, I will say the wrist hovering technique takes a lot of control. It's very tiring, and I mess up pretty often because I have hand tremors. It would be better to wait until everything is dry and then be able to rest your hand lightly on the paper. So speaking of dry, I have applied that second layer to Pancake's fur, and now I'm starting to fill in the blacks on his eyes. So I'm actually using Payne's Gray, not a true black, to start his irises. No, his pupils, sorry. I'm also going to paint in shadows into his mouth so that you guys can see his little tongue, using a little bit of negative painting. So I'm leaving the lighter color unpainted, and I am painting in the rest of his mouth around that. And then I'm going to add some shadows to his collar as well. So Pancake's getting a third layer of paint. This is the thickest, the most saturated, and the layer that contains the most black. So there are different ways to paint black cats. You can definitely paint them as little void kitties with no highlights at all. But my first cat was a black oriental cat, and Pancake is modeled after her, and she had very glossy black fur. So that's what I'm trying to emulate here. He's not entirely a void, he's a shiny black void. So I'm reserving my darkest black for the darkest shadows, because even when you're painting very dark things, it's good to have highlights, midtones, and shadows. So you have to kind of reserve yourself. You kind of have to hold back and make sure those darkest colors are saved for last. So now that the watercolors are painted, it's time to get happy with some white gouache. I am going to add so many highlights to this because a lot of my contrast and a lot of my definition got lost painting all those layers. So the tinsel has lost a lot of its reflectivity, its vibrancy, and what makes it read as tinsel. So I'm going to use a lot of white gouache highlights to kind of make it look really reflective again. And a fun technique that works well for tinsel specifically is working with your gouache a little bit dry so you get a dry brush or kind of a streaky or speckled effect. It just really reads as tinsel. So you guys can see the wages that my impatience has purchased me. You see there is a lot of rippling and buckling in the paper. Ideally, I would have allowed this to dry overnight and then it would have dried completely flat, but I was working on a pretty tight timeline, so I had to remove it before it was 100% completely dry. It was dry to the touch, but generally before I remove something like this, it's good to let it dry overnight so it can kind of flatten out. And I am removing the tape by pulling it away at a 90-degree angle. So that is our painted pancake Paperchild. Stay tuned at 12:30. I'm going to release the second part of this tutorial where I show you how to turn this 2D character into a 2.5D character that you can pose in the 3D world. hope you guys found this tutorial to be helpful, useful, and informative. I sure had fun painting this cutie, and I really had a lot of fun sharing it with you guys today. If you're new to the channel, please hit the subscribe button. I've got lots of great content that goes live all the time, and click the bell notification so YouTube lets you know when the channel updates. Happy holidays, guys. Bye.